All right, so today I'm going to do a little video to talk through the history and the framework of Washington, D.C., including walking through 10 layers of the city to help you understand how the nation's capital works. So, from 1790 to 1800, the capital of the United States was actually in Philadelphia. When the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776 and when the Constitution was subsequently written in 1787, both documents were effectively written within the confines of this building in Philadelphia known as Independence Hall. You can go tour Independence Hall today for $1. You can go see the very spaces where the Constitution and the Declaration were signed. You can also go see the original Senate chamber of the United States, as well as the original House of Representatives chamber, where Congress and the Senate deliberated in the 1790s. The House, where George Washington lived when he was the President of the United States for most of his tenure in the 1790s, was located at the corner of 6th and Market Streets in Philadelphia. You can see the basic framework of that house today, although the original house no longer exists. But having Philadelphia as the nation's capital in the 1790s provided some problems. For one thing, having the capital located within a single state gave that state both a little bit of an advantage over the other states and created some technical hurdles, one of which was the fact that the defense of the nation's capital and capital facilities was contingent on the militia for that state agreeing to take the actions that the federal government wanted it to take. To eliminate undue influence of one state over the capital of the country, it was agreed in the 1780s that the United States needed a new capital city. George Washington was originally tasked with locating a new location for the new capital for the new nation, and because he had a home just south of the current location of Washington, D.C., at the site known as Mount Vernon, you can go tour George Washington's homestead at Mount Vernon to this day. It's a fun little adventure just south of Washington, D.C. George Washington was a Virginian and very, well, let's say partial to the notion of a capital that was somewhere in this part of the country. There was a little bit of backroom negotiating going on. One of the big issues in the country at the time was the question of whether the federal government would take on the responsibility for paying off the war debts for many of the southern states. Many of the northern states, I should say. Many of the southern states were not particularly happy about that state of affairs. That seemed like a special giveaway, perhaps, to the northern states at the expense of all the states. And so one of the compromises in response to that deliberation was that the location for the new capital for the new nation should be located slightly south of its original Philadelphia location. And so when George Washington was tasked with locating a site for the new capital, he selected this site, the site that is now known as Washington, D.C. Back then, there wasn't really a whole lot going on in Washington, D.C., but it was deemed a relatively suitable site, both because there was a small existing port there in what is now known as the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C. To this day, if you go to Georgetown, it is a slightly older feeling community than the rest of Washington, D.C., and the reason for that is that it is a slightly older community than the rest of Washington, D.C. The rest of the area was predominantly meadows, but they sat adjacent to a wide stretch of marshland that was part of the Potomac River. And while the Potomac River today is not necessarily known as a major shipping arterial for the United States, back at the time, the Potomac River was deemed and anticipated to be a major important waterway within the fledgling new nation. And so for a lot of reasons, this location near the town of Georgetown along the Potomac River made a lot of sense for the new capital. So George Washington decided this is where the capital should be. And so in the early days, it was decided that the capital should take a little bit of land out of the existing states of Maryland and Virginia. The new capital would be agreed upon as a 10 by 10 mile square that was substantially larger than the size needed to house the federal government at the time. But George Washington and many of the other founding fathers from the very start had a vision that the United States would eventually grow into a large and prosperous nation, and they wanted to give the new capital plenty of space to breathe and potentially become one of the great cities of the world, a city that could potentially one day rival the great capitals of Europe like Paris, London, and the like. And so the 10 by 10 mile square was selected. The 10 by 10 mile square, of course, was divided not quite halfway down the middle. In fact, it was a little bit off kilter, but it included the Virginia portion of Washington, D.C. Virginia gave land, and then on the other side, this other portion of the diamond was land that was taken from the state of Maryland. Now, it just so happened that eventually, in the 1840s, the land that used to be part of Washington, D.C., that had been given by the state of Virginia, was eventually ceded back into the state of Virginia. And so the capital of Washington, D.C. today is kind of an incomplete diamond. You can think of it as a kind of a diamond with a bite out of it. It comprises this set of the original linear boundaries and then is basically cut off where the Potomac River cuts through it. And so Washington, D.C., rather than a 100 square mile square, is in fact a 73 square mile semi-square with a bite out of it, and basically sits entirely within land that was originally part of the state of Maryland. George Washington didn't plan the city of Washington himself, nor did Thomas Jefferson. But it just so happened that George Washington knew an able-bodied architect. George Washington, of course, was the commanding general of the Revolutionary Army during the Revolutionary War. And he just happened to have a soldier who had worked for him, who was from France, who happened to be an architect, and who happened to be the architect who had designed the very building in New York City where, in 1789, George Washington had taken the oath of office to the presidency. That was the original City Hall in New York City. It no longer exists. But George Washington knew the guy well. He was so impressed with his handiwork that he hired him to plan the new city of Washington. That individual's name was Pierre Charles L'Enfant, and in 1789 he got to work designing a plan for the new capital city. That plan was ultimately issued in 1791 and then refined several more times throughout the city's history, most notably in 1902, when famed architect Daniel Burnham, who also wrote the city plan for Chicago, wrote a little bit of a revamp of the city plan for Washington, D.C. that built upon Pierre Charles L'Enfant's original framework. So, what was in that original framework? Well, for one thing, Washington, D.C. was subdivided into its original quadrants. Washington, D.C., famously, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you likely have experienced this. It can be very confusing for those who are first-time visitors to the city. It is divided into a series of quadrants that are based on a north-south and east-west dividing line that breaks the city into a northwest portion, a northeast portion, a southeast portion, and a very small southwest portion that sits right along the Potomac River in the small area that falls at the confluence, the southwest confluence, southwest area relative to the confluence of this dividing axis. To this day, the northwest part of Washington, D.C. is the fanciest part of the city. It is the part where most of the city's downtown sits. It is also the part where most of the city's fancy neighborhoods and embassies and things like that also sit. It is also where the White House sits. The northeast and southeast portions of the city are primarily residential, although the south includes things like the Navy Yard neighborhood of Washington, D.C., and the Washington Nationals Park, and again, southwest is a pretty small part of the city that doesn't really have a lot in it except for the wharf development, which is a popular destination for people looking for retail and restaurants right along a little estuary of the Potomac River. So it is said, and many people assume, that based on the experience of Washington, D.C., that the Washington Monument is the center point of that north, south, east, west axis. That is actually not quite the case. The center point of that axis actually is very close to the Washington Monument, but slightly to the northwest of that. This location known as the Jefferson Pier Stone, which sits on the lawn surrounding the Washington Monument, is the actual physical devising point that frames the north, south, east, west axes that subdivide the city into north, northwest, southwest, northeast, and southeast. So, originally, though, there was very little here in the city of Washington. None of the downtown existed. The National Mall did not exist. In fact, even the Potomac River didn't quite exist in its current form. Originally in Washington, the Potomac River was much wider than it is today. The bank of the Potomac River that exists was essentially formed artificially when they infilled land that was previously part of the Potomac River Marsh that occupied basically the area that today is comprised by the western portions of the National Mall, including the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, the FDR Memorial, and East Potomac Park. That land basically was all part of the river back in the day up until the very end of the 19th century. And so that meant that a big chunk of what we now today know as the National Mall, in fact, some of the most memorable parts of the National Mall basically didn't exist. Of course, the mall itself didn't exist at all yet. For one thing, many of the figures and events that are commemorated in the National Mall hadn't even yet happened. So, when Pierre-Charles L'Enfant started planning the city, he planned much of the framework that comprises the city today. It included a plan for a whole bunch of gridded blocks, sort of like you end up seeing in the actual implementation of Washington, D.C. It included a whole bunch of angular streets. These were modeled in part after the city of Paris. And then in turn, when Baron Haussmann went into Paris and carved in a whole bunch more diagonal streets in the 1850s and 1860s, he was actually looking retroactively back at Washington, D.C. to learn some lessons from our capital. But none of that existed back at the origin point of the nation's capital. In fact, the area in the center point of the nation's capital, this what is now known as sort of the bowl of the nation's capital, that was lowland. That was relatively swampy, marshy territory. It was relatively green, but it certainly did not have a city on it. And so Washington, D.C. was always a bit of a project. The first parts of the Pierre-Charles L'Enfant vision to be implemented were the most important buildings in all of Washington, D.C., both of which were started by the first few years of the 1800s. These included the need for a house for the president. The White House was essentially set up in around 1801 to 1803. And then over here, the United States Capitol building began being built in a rather fledgling form in around the same time period between 1801 and 1803. Those two buildings were located basically where they exist today as part of that original L'Enfant plan. And if you had come to Washington in that first decade of the 1800s, those basically would be, for the most part, the only real buildings you would see. The only other thing you would have seen was the axis that connected between them, and that is the axis that is now known as the most famous part of Pennsylvania Avenue, one of the nation's most famous boulevards, America's Federal Street, if you will. That street is today lined by federal buildings. It is the primary portion of the inaugural parade route. After the president is inaugurated at the Capitol, they get in a limousine and they travel down Pennsylvania Avenue to the adoration of throngs of adoring crowds and eventually arrive at the White House, where they then live and prosper, hopefully. But that was the original axis of Washington, D.C. And for the first few years of the 1800s, that's basically all you would have experienced. Even the original Capitol was only a shell of what we know as the Capitol today. The original Capitol included small wings for the Congress and the Senate. There was a little wood corridor between the two of them. It was a long and grinding process. The dome that sits over the Capitol today wasn't built until the middle part of the Civil War period. And the buildings that comprise the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress didn't exist. Everybody basically existed all in that one building, except for the president, who had their own building. And everybody who came into town to work for the government, the Congress, the senators, etc., basically came in. It was anticipated that those would be part-time roles. For one thing, you didn't really want to be in Washington, especially in the summer months. It was a very swampy city full of vegetation and gnats and disease and malaria. It just really wasn't a very hospitable place, in addition to not having very much to do and not very many buildings other than these initial federal facilities. Washington, D.C. did grow over time. And so when we think about the structure of Washington, D.C., as we experience the city today, I would consider this loop between the White House and the Capitol building to be essentially the first layer to understanding the city of Washington. And so that is what we will frame here as number one of our structural pursuit to identify the 10 structural layers of the nation's capital. So the second aspect of the nation's capital that is basically unmistakable is the fact that threading together between the Capitol and the White House is one of the most unique and iconic experiences anywhere in the world, and that is the experience of the National Mall. The National Mall today exists in several parts. That is the part here between the Capitol and the Washington Monument. That is a very memorable portion of the National Mall that often has festivals and other events set up across it. There is the portion of the National Mall over here that was originally part of that swampland that I talked about that wasn't filled in until the end of the 19th century, that comprises the Lincoln Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial Affecting Pool and the World War II Memorial. There is the section here to the north that connects between the Washington Monument and the White House grounds. That is basically occupied by what we now call the Ellipse. And there is the portion here to the south, which is basically occupied by the Tidal Basin, as well as the FDR Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial. And between them is the area here in the middle that basically is the grounds of the Washington Monument. And so, in a sense, the National Mall today sort of exists as a bit of a cross, and each of the arms of the cross has its own unique character and identity. Now, again, when the country was first, when the city of Washington was first developed, none of that really existed. Although even the original Pierre Charles L'Enfant plan recognized that eventually America would be a country with a somewhat notable history, and we would want a place to sort of serve as a national parkland, a national celebration ground, a place to have national monuments, and around which we could establish a bit of a national identity. Unlike the European countries that we now saw as our potential rivals, America didn't have the long lineage and ethnic identity that was shared between a people that had lived on the same country or continent for thousands of years. America was an experiment of people who had voluntarily chosen to be here, or in some cases involuntarily chosen to be here. And it was pretty imperative that we leaned into our history a bit to build out that shared lore, that shared sense of purpose and mission that could give us a bit of identity and memory as a country. And so when it was decided that we should start building out the National Mall as another part of the framework of Washington, D.C., the first thing that everyone agreed was very important to do was to build a memorial to the nation's first president. And that, of course, was General George Washington, who then later became President George Washington. He was, again, of course, the commanding general of the Revolutionary Army. He was also the first president of the country, and he set basically in place many of the norms and just kind of rules of conduct for how a president should carry him or herself. And so he was basically a pretty iconic person for us to create some kind of monument or memorial to. He was perhaps, of all the important founding fathers, maybe the very most important one. I don't even know if that's in dispute. He was the most important founding father. And so it was basically not really in question the notion that he should have a monument at the center of the nation's capital city, the capital city that, of course, bore his name. But this took a while for them to eventually get up the organization, the funding, and the sense of purpose to start developing a Washington monument. It wasn't until the 1830s and the 1840s that the project really got momentum and got off the ground. The location for the Washington Monument at basically the very center of the city, very close to the pier stone, was never in doubt, although the structural viability of that location was very much in doubt. The original thinking was that the Washington Monument, in fact, should be at the center point of that north-south, east-west axis. The thinking was that you put the Washington Monument at the very center, you would have a direct point of access to the White House to the north, and then to the Capitol to the east, and that would give the city a bit of geometric symmetry when you think about the fact that Pennsylvania Avenue is also a diagonal that connects between the Capitol and the White House. Now, it just so turned out that when they started examining the quality of the land that sat at that direct center point, they concluded there actually was not buildability to that site. They decided they actually needed to move the location of the Washington Monument by a few feet to a part of the ground that had a little bit more sturdiness to it, and so they selected the location where the Washington Monument exists today. The original vision for the Washington Monument, and there were quite a few proposals submitted for what that original monument should look like, but the primary original vision was to have a circular tower for the monument that would sit around basically a circular colonnade that would include statues of all of America's founding fathers. Now, there was a lot of question when America started looking at the notion of identity for the National Mall. What kind of character we should bestow upon monuments and memorials, but also the parklands and the open spaces that would surround those monuments and those memorials. Again, America didn't have its own deep, long history. It didn't have that kind of deep shared lineage, which meant, unlike much of Europe, it didn't have an architectural identity that was singular in order to lean into. What America did have, though, was a lot of inspiration. Obviously, the notion of a democracy of the sort that we had constructed with a president and a legislative branch and a judicial branch was not an exact replica of anything that existed in Europe, but it borrowed parts and pieces from many historical forms of government that had existed around the world. Obviously, many of the founding fathers were British. Basically, they were all British. And in addition to that, France had helped America in the Revolutionary War, and so there were obvious influences from Britain and France that helped shape the architecture and design of the nation's capital. Further, though, the original governance structure for the country was based also in ideals that drew from Greece and Rome. And so you see a lot of Greek and Roman influence in Washington, D.C. The Lincoln Memorial, for instance, is designed in the style of essentially a Greek temple, and that was very intentional. Abraham Lincoln spoke to the ideals of democracy, the need to preserve democracy, and so it was decided that his memorial should embody the ideals of ancient Greece. Thomas Jefferson, by contrast, reflected the creation of the governmental structure of the country, and so it was decided that his monument, when it was constructed, should mimic a little bit of the pantheon, and there are subtle differences between the Greek and Roman stylings of the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials, respectively. The landscapes of the National Mall to this day reflect a bit of a intersection of French and British thinking. You see a lot of areas of the National Mall that have this formal, linear nature to them. This is very similar to what you would find if you went to, say, the Palace of Versailles in Paris, or the Tuileries Gardens, or places like that. There is much of the National Mall that is formal and French, Parisian, if you will, but there are also parts of the National Mall that begin to have these kinds of curvilinear and organic paths with sporadic trees, and these draw from much of the influence, and in some cases the literal designs, of Frederick Law Olmsted and the British tradition of meadows and paths and curvilinear open spaces with some rolling hills. And so you get a little bit of a combination when it comes to the National Mall. And you see that even here on the grounds of, say, the Washington Monument that we're panning over right now, giving way to the more linear and orthogonal framing of the World War II Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool. So that's all to say, you had some French influence, you had some British influence, you had some Greek influence, you had some Roman influence. When it came time to build the monument to George Washington, there was also another culture that came into play, and that was ancient Egypt. At the time of the founding of the country, it was broadly regarded across the world that ancient Egypt was the longest tenured and sturdiest civilization that had ever existed in the history of the world. It dated back thousands of years with a deep and sturdy history. It was regarded as a beacon, at least symbolically, that could be mimicked if your goal was to try to showcase a country that, despite its young age, had the potential to be a very long-lived and sturdy country that could endure and compete with the greatest countries of the world. And so, partly it was due to cost. The original, more ornate notion of the Washington Monument was deemed a little bit too out of reach. The notion of building individual sculptural columns to represent the various founding fathers was an expensive undertaking. And they, in part due to cost and in part due to design, ended up deciding to do the Washington Monument more as an Egyptian obelisk than as some kind of Greek or Roman temple. The Egyptian obelisk, again, spoke to the notion of a sturdy and enduring nation. Despite its young age, this was the aspirational notions of the planners of the city, the founding fathers of our country, that even before everyone else could see it or experience it, and without 250 years hindsight, they knew, and at least wanted to communicate through their architecture, that America would long endure. The original vision of the Washington Monument was planned to be 600 feet tall. In fact, the actual Washington Monument is only 555 feet tall, but it is basically exactly a 10-to-1 ratio between its height and its width. The Washington Monument is made out of stone. The stone is basically freestanding. There is actually no mortar that holds the stones together. If you had a strong enough wind, in theory, the Washington Monument could blow over. There is mortar. If you walk up to the Washington Monument today, you'll see mortar between the stones. That is just essentially mortar to keep the water from getting in between the stones, but it is not structural mortar. The Washington Monument is basically a freestanding structure only held up by its own weight. At the base of the memorial, the walls are some 18 feet thick, and they gradually taper as the monument gets to its tallest heights. And you can go up the Washington Monument to this day and get the views here over the city of Washington. The Washington Monument is, in fact, surrounded by a circular plaza with flags representing the 50 states of the country. That is a bit of an homage to the original design, the notion of the colonnade that would have, I guess, been a series of circular stone columns representing the founding fathers. It is kind of an abstract interpretation of that original concept. Washington Monument was begun in the 1830s. It was not completed until the 1880s. Construction paused 2 different times, and you can actually see to this day the lines where the memorial changes color twice because the construction, when it paused, left a couple additional decades of wear and tear at the lower portions. And then at the upper portions, obviously, had to be quarried from a different quarry by the time that construction resumed. But eventually, the Washington Monument was completed. And to this day, it is the tallest point in the city of Washington. And it is one of a few presidential memorials that now exist on the National Mall. Once the land of the National Mall was filled in here over on the west, there was a lot of space for new monuments and memorials, and gradually over time, America filled in the National Mall. Many of these monuments and memorials are younger than people realize. The Lincoln Memorial was only built in 1922, opening in 1928, and the Jefferson Memorial only opened in 1946. So when it comes to presidential memorials that occupy the National Mall, of course, there is the Washington Monument here at the center of the National Mall. On axis with the Washington Monument, there, of course, is the Lincoln Memorial, built to honor the nation's 16th president. Washington and Lincoln kind of go together as arguably our 2 greatest and most important presidents, serving respective roles in our grand national story. Also very significant is the Thomas Jefferson Memorial. Thomas Jefferson is, of course, tremendously significant as a founding father, as the chief author of both the Declaration and the Constitution, in addition to being president from 1801 to 1809, completing things like Louisiana Purchase. While his memorial was a little bit later addition, it's symbolically very important. And it takes advantage of the fact that the Washington Monument was built a little bit off axis from the true north-south, east-west radial axes emanating from the central stone, the pier stone of Washington, D.C. The Jefferson Memorial includes a statue of Thomas Jefferson that looks out directly over the tidal basin, and that's very intentional. If you were to draw a straight north line from the Thomas Jefferson Memorial north, you would bypass the Washington Monument, and you would basically be looking directly into the back windows of the White House that exists just north of where the screen is cutting off right now. And so there is a symbolic notion to the idea that Thomas Jefferson and the representation of the ideals of the Declaration of the Constitution are always keeping watch over the presidency. Thomas Jefferson is literally looking into the back windows of the White House just to make sure that each president, as their tenures transfer over, is adhering to the ideals of those founding documents and that they are never lost. We also include in the presidential lineage a monument to Franklin D. Roosevelt. Many people consider him one of the nation's greatest presidents. He has a monument there adjacent to the tidal basin. It's a long and sprawling memorial that reflects the long and sprawling nature of his presidency. More recently, we have added the addition of the Dwight Eisenhower Memorial. That sits just south of the National Mall over here. We also have a memorial to President Ulysses Grant right in front of the Capitol building here over at the far eastern terminus of the National Mall. And immediately adjacent to that is a small memorial to President James Garfield, who is substantially less consequential as a president than the others that are honored with key memorials, but who I guess they felt deserved a memorial because he was assassinated on the streets of Washington near the location of what is today the National Gallery of Art. He was shot, he lingered for 80 days, eventually perished, and while the memorial is not on the exact site of his shooting, it is somewhat nearby, and that probably makes some sense that he is thus memorialized there. So those are the primary presidential memorials that exist adjacent to the National Mall. There are obviously many other presidential namesakes around Washington, but to get a giant memorial on the National Mall, you have to be a pretty consequential president. And those are the ones we have decided to this date are the most consequential ones. I should say that in addition to those presidential memorials, there is one additional president who has a very significant memorial in Washington, D.C., and that is Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt has his own island that sits here in the middle of the Potomac River. This is Teddy Roosevelt Island. It is basically an undeveloped island. You can walk to it. It's a little bit of a roundabout walk. You got to go up through Georgetown, take some paths down along the Virginia coastline, and then cross over via a footbridge that takes you over to the island. And on the island, there is a memorial to Teddy Roosevelt. Many people don't know this memorial even exists. It is actually one of the more interesting and notable memorials in Washington, D.C. Not that many people go and visit it because it's hard to get to, but it's really cool. It sits there within the island. It is surrounded by trees. It has a couple of fountains. It's actually one of the better memorials in Washington and one of the best kept secrets to the National Mall ecosystem, although physically, of course, it is separated from the National Mall. President Kennedy also has a statue here as part of the Kennedy Center, although that is not exactly part of the National Mall. It's also a little bit of a trip to get to. But you can, if you really want to, you can go find President Kennedy and his statue adjacent to this outdoor area around the Kennedy Center. There he is. John F. Kennedy. All right, let's get ourselves back to the National Mall here so we can keep talking about it. So, National Mall, there's a lot to unpack. So, honoring the presidents is a big part of the formal function of the National Mall. It was decided actually pretty late that as part of the framework of the National Mall, we should also include monuments and memorials that honor the sacrifices of Americans for some of our most significant international conflicts. And most of the war memorials that exist on the National Mall, in and amongst the presidential memorials, are relatively new. The Vietnam Memorial was a very consequential but also very controversial addition to the National Mall, only added in around 1981. The monument to the Korean War sacrifices is located just across the National Mall, proximate to the Lincoln Memorial. That only opened in about 1995. We now have also a memorial to the veterans of World War II that exists between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. That only opened in about 2004. And we have a monument up here to World War I veterans that only opened within the last few years. It is said that we will soon be adding an additional monument to the veterans of the Iraq wars, which is going to be located probably somewhere around this area, just to the northwest of the Lincoln Memorial. So war memorials have become part of the fabric of the National Mall today, in and amongst the various other monuments to our presidents. The one other memorial that I will take some time to make reference to here is the memorial that was built to honor Martin Luther King Jr., of course, a really important figure in American history and perhaps the symbolic embodiment of the broader struggle for civil rights that has been part of the American story for a very long time. Now, we talked about the importance of the axial vista between the Jefferson Memorial and the ability for Thomas Jefferson to keep an eye on the White House to the north here to make sure that the president is abiding by the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Well, the memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. adds another dimension to that story. The memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. is located directly on axis between the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial. In a sense, Martin Luther King is a bit of a bridge between the struggle that was won through the Civil War, the victory that was won through the Civil War on behalf of a country that would eliminate slavery, and America ultimately realizing the full fulfillment of its democratic ideals outlined in the Declaration and the Constitution. Martin Luther King is an important part of the linking story between those two struggles and those two aspects of our history. So part of the thinking is here, and if you've ever been there, you will notice that Martin Luther King and his memorial stares directly at the Jefferson Memorial, is that just as Thomas Jefferson and the ideals of the Declaration and the Constitution are keeping an eye on the president, so too is Martin Luther King keeping an eye directly on the ideals of those documents and making sure that America, in its quest ever to pursue the ideals that it aspires to, is upholding the rights and liberties of all its people. And you can see that here as we zoom in and take a quick look at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. You can see him emerging out of a piece of stone here, looking across the tidal basin, and he is staring basically directly at Thomas Jefferson, who sits within his pantheon here at the Jefferson Memorial. So, of course, there's a lot to unpack on the National Mall. But broadly speaking, when it comes to our structural story of the city of Washington, if we're going to say that the link here between the White House and the Capitol along Pennsylvania Avenue is, in a sense, the first layer of understanding the structure of Washington, D.C. and how it works, understanding the National Mall, the monuments to the presidents, the monuments to our wars, and the landscapes that sit in between them all, is perhaps a second layer of Washington, D.C. that is important to fully understand and links these things together. The third layer of Washington, D.C. that is pretty important to understand as part of understanding the structure of the city is the series of things that sit immediately adjacent to the National Mall. The third layer of Washington, D.C. is effectively comprised by the series of museums and, in some cases, small parks that immediately align the National Mall, predominantly the Smithsonian museums that help fill in the national story in a little bit more of a literal and academic way. And the band of Smithsonians that align the National Mall directly proximately between Independence Avenue to the south and Constitution Avenue to the north comprise one of the most important collections of museums anywhere in the world. Now, as we zoom in and take a look at some of those monuments or some of those museums that line the National Mall, there are a whole bunch of them. So, starting here on the north side of the National Mall, there are the two wings of the National Gallery of Art. The west wing of the National Gallery of Art is the older wing that comprises the largest collection within the National Gallery of Art. It's actually a really, really, really good art museum. It's one of the very best in the world, and it comprises masterworks of American history. It comprises a great Impressionist collection. They have great sculptures. They have great furniture. It's a really, really nice museum. It is linked by an underground tunnel to the National Gallery of Art East Wing building, which contains mostly modern art. That building was added much more recently. It's designed by unpack, who is a famous architect. And it is, I guess you can see, it's a much more modern in its stylings as a building. As you move along the north side of the National Mall, the National Sculpture Garden is a popular destination. A lot of locals like hanging out there. Tourists like it as well. It has limited hours, so sometimes you go and it's closed, but it's really, really nice, especially on a hot day with the fountain, the ducks, lots of benches. There's a little outdoor cafe. They even have a small replica of a Paris metro station that sits within the park there, and then there are various sculptures scattered around the space. Just to the north of that is the National Archives, which has 2 copies of the Declaration of Independence. The Smithsonian Museum of Natural History is another crowd favorite, and then the Smithsonian Museum of American History is the quintessential museum about American history. Adjacent to that is a relatively new museum, the National Museum of African American History. And then as we jump over the north side of the National Mall across the Washington Monument grounds is one more piece here worth pointing out, and that is this piece of land known as Constitution Gardens, and it includes a memorial to the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and it is a nice little pond full of ducks and things like that. On the north side, as you peel off the National Mall, you also get to the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, which is a performance venue that houses some of the most important national performances that our country hosts. On the south side of the National Mall, you have a few more museums related to the Smithsonian. You have the National Museum of Asian Art. You have the Smithsonian Castle, which mainly hosts events but is famous for its look. It has been featured in multiple movies, including Night at the Museum. You have basically the carousel in the National Mall. You have the Hirshhorn Museum, which is a modern art museum, and the Hirshhorn Sculpture Garden. You have the Air and Space Museum, which is the most visited of all of the Smithsonian museums along the National Mall, and you have the National Museum of the American Indian. There are other Smithsonian museums that aren't immediately adjacent to the National Mall, but this collection that is adjacent to the National Mall is certainly the crux of the Smithsonian collection. In the nearby proximity, you also have the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. That's not a Smithsonian, but it is an important museum in Washington, D.C., and things like the International Spy Museum and the Museum of the Bible, all of which are relatively popular attractions, although they are not Smithsonians themselves. The United States Botanic Garden is another museum that sits proximate to the National Mall. That's also a really interesting place that has plants and horticulture from all 50 states. So you might think of these rows of Smithsonian museums that sit immediately north and south of the National Mall as a sort of third layer to understanding the nation's capital. All right, layer number 4. We'll think about layer number 4 of the nation's capital. We're going to talk a little bit about the Capitol grounds, because while the National Mall has a lot to it, it wouldn't be complete if it weren't for this eastern portion of facilities that round out the part of the federal core of Washington, D.C. The Capitol grounds is administratively its own little jurisdiction. It is essentially operated by an agency of its own that reports to Congress, and it comprises a lot of important facilities. Obviously, the Capitol building is the most important part of the U.S. Capitol grounds. Capitol building, of course, is where the United States Congress, the House of Representatives, and the United States Senate both meet. It also used to be where the United States Supreme Court held court and where the Library of Congress was kept as originally the library collection that came from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. The U.S. Capitol grounds portion of Washington, D.C. also includes Union Station here to the north. That's the famous train station here in Washington, D.C. It includes the Postal Museum that sits just proximate to Union Station. It includes the Russell, Dirksen, and Hart Senate office buildings, basically where the senators have their individual offices, and then the Rayburn, Longworth, and Cannon House office buildings, where the House of Representatives members have their suites of offices. Both of those sets of office buildings are connected by a series of underground subway tunnels that connect over back to the United States Capitol building. As the legislative footprint of the Congress and the Senate grew, the Supreme Court was eventually forced out into its own building that is part of the Capitol grounds here just to the east. And the Library of Congress was also forced out into its own building here, named after Thomas Jefferson, that also sits just to the east. And even it has expanded into a couple of additional buildings, the Adams Building and the Madison Building, that house additional resources for the Library of Congress. Those three buildings together sit basically just to the southeast of the United States Capitol building. The U.S. Capitol grounds also includes the Capitol Reflecting Pool. We talked about the memorial to Ulysses S. Grant that is part of that area of the National Mall. It includes the Capitol grounds themselves. It includes the U.S. Botanic Garden. It includes the Bertoldi Fountain, and it includes the upper and lower Senate parks that sit basically over the Senate parking garage. It includes the U.S. Capitol Police, and it includes a memorial here to the victims of the Japanese internment camps that existed during World War II. So there's a lot going on up there on the U.S. Capitol grounds, and you can think of that collectively as a sort of fourth layer to the structure of Washington, D.C. The fifth layer we might talk about when it comes to understanding the structure of the nation's capital is the part of Washington, D.C. that sits just north of Constitution Avenue on the north side of the National Mall, and the portion of Washington, D.C. that just sits just south of Independence Avenue on the south side of the National Mall. For the first few blocks of downtown Washington, D.C. on either side of the National Mall, north and south of the Smithsonian Museums, is a portion of the city that is primarily, though not exclusively, comprised of large buildings that house some of the most significant federal agencies. If you've ever visited Washington, D.C. and stayed at a hotel that was more up in the downtown of the city and tried to walk your way down to the National Mall, you know how long that walk can be. And you know how few restaurants you might see along the way. Part of the reason for that is this band of buildings that are primarily the home of federal agencies that sit between the downtown and the National Mall are pretty austere. Many of them are brutalist. They are very big buildings. They house a lot of offices, and they are heavily secured, meaning there aren't a lot of stores or restaurants on the ground floor. And so if we zoom into some of those buildings, I'm not going to hit all of them because I'll probably forget some. I don't even know some of them, and there are a lot of them. But they include the multi-building network belonging to the Department of State, the State Department headquarters that sit over here. They comprise the buildings of the Federal Reserve that sit here on the north side of the National Mall. They comprise the U.S. Department of the Interior. You can see a few buildings that sit in here that are museums and not federal agencies. But as we jump over the ellipse here, you can see the Herbert Hoover Building, the Ronald Reagan building in the area known as Federal Triangle. These are like really, really sort of obvious federal agency looking buildings. They include the Bureau of Industry and Security, the National Department of Commerce. As we move here to the east, we get to the IRS, we get to the FBI building, we get to the Department of Justice. We eventually get over here to the Federal Trade Commission, and we get to the Department of Labor, which is a really big and kind of austere, brutalist building that spans multiple roadways and really kind of breaks up the urban fabric of the city. Notably, in and amongst this stuff is the United States Navy Memorial that sits just to Pennsylvania Avenue as well. But lots of big federal agencies that occupy the first few blocks of the downtown to the north side of the National Mall. And as we come over to the south side, there are also several big agency buildings that sit on the south side of the National Mall in the area known as L'Enfant Plaza. This is a pretty austere part of downtown Washington. Not really the kind of place you want to stay, not really necessarily the kind of place you want to visit. It's just very dead on the streets and not all that exciting. But there are a lot of big federal agency buildings over here. They include the Department of Health and Human Services. They include the Department of Education. They include the Department of Transportation, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They include the Department of Agriculture and the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, among others. And so these big clusters of federal agencies, while they are not exclusive, they're obviously federal agencies that span much of the rest of the district and other parts of the greater Washington area, and then also other parts of the country as well. But these bands of federal buildings that sit basically to the north and to the south of the National Mall are the largest and most intensive cluster of federal agency buildings anywhere in our country, and they are a defining part of the character of downtown Washington, D.C. So, to take stock again, layer one, the barbell linking between the Capitol and the White House along Pennsylvania Avenue. Layer two, the National Mall. Layer three, the Smithsonian's that sit just north and just south of the National Mall. Layer four, the U.S. Capitol grounds. Layer five, we're now talking about the federal agencies that sit to the north and to the south of the National Mall and the museums. Layer six we'll talk about is the actual downtown of Washington, D.C. And that fills in basically the area just north of many of those big federal agency buildings, side skirts the White House, and essentially fills in all of this area. The northern boundaries of what we consider downtown are a little bit fluid. There's no formal definition to it. But you could probably assume downtown essentially goes over here all the way to about where Union Station is and eats up a lot of territory. One of the unique things about Washington, D.C. is that there is a citywide height limit within the city. The reasons for that are a little bit convoluted, a little bit complicated, but there is a Height Act that basically limits buildings to being in the downtown area no more than generally about 12 stories tall. A lot of people think it has to do with the height of the Washington Monument. It really has nothing to do with the height of the Washington Monument. Washington Monument is the height of a 55-story building. The buildings in downtown are generally about 12 stories. The buildings in downtown are limited by the Height Act, which has more to do with the relationship between the height of buildings and the width of the streets, the desire to create a city that would mimic the physical form of European capitals, and the height limitations of fire ladders in the 1890s. Long story, we won't get into it now. That has nothing to do with the height of the Washington Monument, has nothing to do with the height of the Capitol building, or any of those mythologies that exist in Washington. It exists for other reasons. But what you get as a result of it is a lot of buildings that are fairly low-rise. They're dense buildings. They fill up their blocks. You don't see many surface parking lots in Washington, D.C. You see a lot of underground parking garages beneath the buildings, and then a very large, sprawling, and intensive downtown that includes the offices of corporations. It includes things like the World Bank. It includes things like major consulting offices. It includes things like major law firms and lobbying groups. And anybody who can get a presence in downtown Washington, D.C. tries to. Sometimes it's hard to find enough office space for all of the employees you want to have because of the height limit, but many, many companies have a significant presence in downtown Washington, D.C. nonetheless. Washington, D.C.'s downtown sprawls on for a large area. Perhaps its most salient heartbeat is the portion of downtown that sits between Washington Circle over here and the Carnegie Library over here. This would be the corridor known as K Street. Of course, the streets of Washington, D.C. are lettered, emanating up from the National Mall: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H Street, I Street. There's no J Street, but there is a K Street. And K Street, in this core portion of downtown, is perhaps the most prestigious business address within the city outside of maybe Pennsylvania Avenue. K Street is notorious as the hub for lobbyists and lobbying groups and law firms and any large company like that that has enough money to afford one of the expensive addresses along K Street. You'll see a lot of people in black suits and sunglasses along K Street. It has a little bit of a vibe of its own, and it is a very important business corridor within the city. A lot of businesses have offices along L Street or I Street as well, but K Street really is the beating heart of that lobbying network of Washington, D.C. Anybody that's trying to build a business that mooches off the federal government or that's in the business of let's say, like lobbying through the members of Congress to try to get things done on behalf of other large companies, wants to be somewhere in the proximity of K Street. In addition to K Street itself, there are several interesting components of downtown DC. We mentioned Washington Circle. That's an interesting little park space. We might talk about Farragut Square and McPherson Square that exist symmetrically in relation there to the White House, and Lafayette Park that sits just north of the White House grounds. There is Franklin Square, another large square, just to the east of that. We mentioned the Carnegie Library, which sits just south of the Washington, D.C. Convention Center. Very proximate to that, just to the south, is the area that used to be home of the old Washington, D.C. Convention Center, known as City Center. That has been redeveloped into the most upscale shopping area of Washington, D.C., where you can go to the Tiffany store and the Kate Spade and the Burberry store and Hugo Boss and all of the fancy brands that you might want to drop a lot of money on. You can go there and spend a lot of money. And it's also a nice little public space. There is the National Portrait Gallery that sits in the middle of downtown DC. There is the arena that hosts the NBA and NHL teams here in Washington as the hub of the part of downtown known as Gallery Place Chinatown, that really is kind of organized around 7th Street and F Street, two of the most important retail corridors that run through downtown DC. There is the area to the east of that known as Judiciary Square that is so named because there are a number of courthouses there. It's a little quieter quadrant of downtown. And then back across on the west is the area of downtown that is basically occupied by the campus of the George Washington University and the campus of the World Bank, which has a whole bunch of buildings sitting in and amongst this portion of downtown DC. Other than that, a lot of office buildings, a lot of fun stuff. But we might think of downtown DC as another layer to understanding the nation's capital. So, again, layer one, White House to the Capitol building. Layer two, the National Mall. Layer three, the Smithsonian Museums. Layer four, the U.S. Capitol grounds. Layer five, the federal agencies north and south of the National Mall. And layer six, downtown DC. Layer 7 we'll talk about. We'll make reference to some of the significant neighborhoods that sit basically just one layer out from the downtown of Washington, D.C. These include the neighborhood of Georgetown over here. Georgetown is, as we said, a very historic part of the nation's capital. It includes the Georgetown waterfront. It includes the famous shopping street along M Street. It includes Georgetown University. It includes the famous Exorcist steps and links to the Key Bridge, which takes people over to Arlington, Virginia. Georgetown is a very desirable address within Washington, D.C., and housing tends to be very expensive there. Just across Rock Creek Park is the area known as the West End. That's also a very ritzy part of Washington, D.C. A lot of nice hotels there, a lot of nice residences. DuPont Circle is a quite famous residential and retail area of Washington, D.C. It is anchored by the diagonal known as Connecticut Avenue. That's a very important part of, important sort of retail corridor within the city. There is Logan Circle, which is organized around another circle, Logan Circle. So DuPont Circle organized around DuPont Circle, Logan Circle organized around Logan Circle. Not quite as upscale as DuPont Circle, but also a nice residential area. There's the area up here known as Shaw, and then there is the area known as the Mount Vernon Triangle. The road running between some of these neighborhoods, this diagonal that cuts through here, is Massachusetts Avenue. Along that avenue, you will see the presence of a lot of think tanks. You'll see a lot of nonprofits, groups like the Brookings Institute have their offices there, as do a lot of the universities from around the country that have a Washington, D.C. presence, so they can send students for a semester or so to experience the nation's capital. The residential area of Capitol Hill sits just to the east of the United States Capitol area of Capitol Hill. And then just to the south is the area of Washington, D.C. known as the Navy Yard that has infilled with the creation of the Washington Nationals ballpark over the last 15 or so years. It includes a lot of newer, kind of bigger apartment buildings, and a lot of young people live there. So this collection of neighborhoods that basically sits one layer out from downtown is an important layer to understanding Washington, D.C. Some people who work in downtown live in these neighborhoods. A lot of people can't afford to live in these neighborhoods. They live further out. And all of these neighborhoods, while they are predominantly residential, also include a fair number of businesses that are part of the ecosystem of downtown D.C. So when you think about some of the functional relationships between some of the layers that we're talking about, obviously the White House and the Capitol, Congress, are some of the core power centers within the city. Obviously, the agencies are execution entities. They sort of execute the mandates of the legislative branch. They are full of lifelong bureaucrats who come to work every day. The people who work in downtown DC mostly work for private companies who are there in part because they kind of mooch off the system. The people that operate a little bit further out from that tend to be these think tanks, the nonprofits, people trying to influence policy on Capitol Hill, sometimes by way of some of their donors. And then the residential neighborhoods that exist around that obviously support the residences and livelihoods of people that work in the city of Washington. So, again, layer one, Capitol to the White House along Pennsylvania Avenue. Layer two, the National Mall. Layer three, the Smithsonian Museums to the north and south of the National Mall. Layer four, Capitol Hill. Layer five, the federal agencies. Layer six, downtown DC. Layer seven, the neighborhoods that float around downtown DC that all have, kind of their own distinctive identities in and around the nation's capital. Layer 8 we might talk about is the area connecting between DuPont Circle, which we have already talked about. That's a pretty major kind of public center point of Washington, D.C. Not so much like civic center point, but like if you want the place in D.C. that maybe has the most like urban energy, DuPont Circle is the kind of place where you'll see people on skateboards and people kind of tooling around, lots of little stores and bookstores and restaurants and things like that. If you follow Mass Ave here up across Rock Creek Park, you get up into the area of Washington, D.C. known as the Northwest. And Northwest D.C. is quite fancy. And if we were to zoom in here a little bit and show you some of what's going on up there, what you will see is that as you emanate out of the area known as DuPont, you start to see a large number of the embassies of countries around the world. These include things like the Embassy of India, as you see there. You'll start to see more, the Embassy of Sudan, the Embassy of Greece, the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea. There's the Embassy of Egypt, among others. As we move our way along here, we get ever more. There's the Vietnam House, there's the Embassy of Kenya, the Embassy of the Republic of Haiti, the Embassy of Kyrgyzstan, the Embassy of Croatia, the Embassy of Cameroon, the Embassy of Malawi, the Embassy of the Ivory Coast, the Embassy of Chad, the Permanent Mission of Mexico, the Embassy of the Marshall Islands, the Embassy of Venezuela, the Embassy of the Republic of Korea, the Embassy of Japan Consular Office, and then the Embassy of Japan itself. We get more as we move along. The Embassy of Belize, the Embassy of Turkey, the Islamic Center of Washington, D.C., the Mission of Spain to the OAS. We pop over the road here up into Northwest D.C., and we're going to see probably a few more embassies here. The Embassy of Brazil, okay, there's another embassy, although it doesn't say what country it is, but lots and lots of embassies here as we move along up into Northwest D.C. There's the Embassy of New Zealand, Denmark, Italy, all the embassies, not all the embassies, but a lot of the embassies sit along this area known as Embassy Row here between DuPont Circle and the Northwest. This leads us to the United States Naval Observatory up here in the Northwest. That is both a working observatory and it includes the residence of the Vice President of the United States. So it is a heavily secured area. Vice President, of course, works at the White House, but they live up here at the Naval Observatory away from the core of Washington, D.C. As we move up just a little bit further into the Northwest, we see things like the Washington National Cathedral, the most famous cathedral in the United States. While it doesn't necessarily hold a candle to some of the great European cathedrals, the U.S. doesn't have that much history, and so this is about the best we have as a cathedral for the country. Some of the fancy schools in the vicinity of it, like the National Cathedral School for girls and the St. Albans School for boys, are among the most expensive private schools anywhere in the country, and the neighborhoods that you start seeing as you move further up into Northwest D.C. are extremely fancy. The housing is fancy, and they are very, very expensive. More embassies dot other parts of Northwest D.C. You see the Embassy of Bangladesh up there, the Embassy of Pakistan, the Embassy of Ethiopia. There's just a whole bunch of them that if you zoom around in Northwest D.C., you will start to see large clusters of embassies. And it's the Embassy of China is up there, or right around International Park. There's Singapore. Let's see, Ghana is up there. There's Israel. There's Jordan. Let's see. Okay, Malaysia, Nigeria. Yeah, lots of embassies up here in this part of Washington, D.C., and again, lots of fancy housing. So the Northwest is where it's at if you want to have a fancy house. American University is up there. Dumbarton Oaks is a really nice little place where you can go and experience nature. The Northwest is kind of where it's at if you want to sort of feel that like fancy Embassy Row part of Washington, D.C., or if you want like a fancy house and to send your kid to a really expensive private school. So that, in a sense, is a kind of eighth layer of Washington, D.C. that we might refer to as the broader northwest of the city. I should say, while we're talking about the Northwest, one neighborhood I didn't make reference to, it kind of doesn't quite fit, sort of sits between DuPont Circle and the Northwest that we're talking about, is the Kalorama neighborhood of Washington. This is another really fancy residential area within the city. It is bordered on the one side by Rock Creek Park. It sort of flows into the DuPont Circle area here to the south, and it is very fancy. It is where Barack Obama has his house up here. Jeff Bezos has his house somewhere around here in the vicinity known as the Spanish Steps. It includes the Washington Hilton, which exists right here, which is the location of the site where Ronald Reagan was shot. Ultimately did not perish, but he was shot in an attempted assassination in 1981. A lot of fancy houses up there in this part of Northwest D.C. Also, a few embassies snuck in. There's the Consulate of Poland, and let's see if we can find, as we scroll around here, the Barack Obama house. There it is, 2446 Belmont Road. Up here in the Kalorama neighborhood is the house where Barack Obama moved after leaving the White House. And as you can see, just lots of very big and fancy houses up here in the Kalorama neighborhood of Washington, D.C., way up here on the hillside. And one of the things about Washington, D.C. is because the core of the city is sort of a bowl, as you move up into neighborhoods like that, the elevations get higher. And so you start having some views back toward the core of the city that are very impressive. Okay, those are 8 layers of Washington. Layer 9 that we'll talk about is the stuff that happens here on the Virginia side near Washington, D.C., because a lot of very interesting things happen on the Virginia side. Down here on the south is the small city of Alexandria. That is a nice little historic town. A lot of people live there. It's a little bit different, a little bit slower paced than the core of Washington. You get Ronald Reagan International Airport. It's very rare that a city of this size has an international airport this close to the downtown of the city. Mostly flies domestic flights, but it's very, very convenient if you live or work in downtown D.C. The neighborhoods of Crystal City and Pentagon City. Crystal City has now, I guess, been rebranded as National Landing. It is home to the new Amazon HQ2, and Pentagon City is home to the famous Pentagon City Mall. And then you get the Pentagon. The Pentagon sits over here. And then adjacent to the Pentagon is Arlington National Cemetery, where, of course, we bury our honored dead. That includes the eternal flame to John F. Kennedy. It includes a few notable graves to people like William Howard Taft, and then acres and acres and acres of graves to fallen U.S. service people. And then over here in Virginia, you get the downtown of Arlington, known as Roslyn, and what they call the Wilson Boulevard Corridor, which is a series of small little downtown clusters in Virginia. Roslyn is the most famous. That is where a lot of the defense contractors have their offices. Groups like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, Halliburton, and the like all seem to have a presence there in downtown Arlington. So you think about this ecosystem of parts and pieces, and you think about the Congress and the Senate and the White House, you think about the federal agencies, you think about the law firms that do lobbying, you think about the think tanks and the nonprofits, the military-industrial complex that also wants to influence policy in ways that give them business to go build planes and bombs and things like that, also has a very significant presence here, very close to downtown D.C. And one of the things that's unique about the city of Roslyn is, unlike downtown D.C. itself, it is not height limited. And so in Roslyn, you see a lot more tall buildings, and it actually feels like the downtown of a major city. And you'll see logos on some of these buildings. I think Deloitte has a logo on the top of one of these buildings. Yep, there's the Deloitte logo. It's blurry because we're in Google Earth, but you can see it there. And yeah, a lot of these big companies. Deloitte's a big consulting operation. And then, okay, let's see, is that, yeah, it's Raytheon. Raytheon Technologies. So yeah, a lot of the big defense contractors have presence there in Northern Virginia. I mentioned Arlington Cemetery, obviously spectacular. And again, Arlington Cemetery has the burial site and the eternal flame to John F. Kennedy. Then it includes acres and acres and acres of grave sites in those iconic rows with all the crosses that people know so well. Arlington Cemetery, of course, is beautiful. It includes the President William Howard Taft Memorial. It includes the old homestead of the family of Robert E. Lee that was turned into the Arlington House that looks back over Washington, D.C. So it's very beautiful and idyllic vista. And then you have the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington Cemetery, next to the Sylvan Theater. And it is home to the famous Changing of the Guard ceremony that people come and witness there at Arlington as well. So Arlington's pretty cool. Obviously very somber and very, very famous. The Pentagon, immediately adjacent. Pentagon is the site of the Washington, D.C. memorial to the 9/11 attack on the Pentagon as well. The Air Force Memorial is also very much adjacent to the Pentagon. We talked about Pentagon City, Crystal City. You can see those are downtowns of their own right, giving way to residential areas. And then Reagan Airport as we move south. And then eventually we get down to the city of Alexandria, which is, again, sort of historic little city down here. But it's hard to understand Washington, D.C. without understanding what happens on the Virginia side. Obviously, the Virginia suburbs sprawl on for a very long way, and places like Fairfax County, of course Arlington County, but Fairfax County, and many of the municipalities within Fairfax County, Loudoun County, become very famous as well over on the Virginia side. If you want to fly, you can either fly out of Reagan Airport, which is mostly a domestic airport over here, very close to downtown D.C., or if you want to get an international flight to Asia or other far-flung parts of the world, you've got to go all the way out here on the Dulles Toll Road to Dulles Airport, which sits way, way, way out in the Virginia suburbs, and generally is a good 45-minute drive or so from the core of Washington, D.C. The final layer of Washington, D.C., I think that is worth understanding if you want to really understand the structure of the nation's capital. Obviously, like any city, as you get further away from the downtown, Washington becomes a very residential city. You have generally very expensive, but in many cases very nice residential neighborhoods, and then clusters of business areas as well. Washington, D.C. is ringed by what they call the Beltway, I-495. That is the ring loop road. Most cities have a sort of ring loop road like this, but the Beltway obviously has sort of an iconic name about it. That was located where it was, supposedly, because Washington, D.C., they wanted to have a kind of circulation route that was far enough outside the center of the city that if someone decided to drop a nuclear bomb on the core of the city, that the infrastructure outside would not be affected. Now, nuclear technology has changed a lot over the years, and so I don't know if that still functions in the same way, but I-495 is very significant as an organizing mechanism. But the 10th and most significant layer of Washington, D.C. that is important to understand is this network of satellite downtowns. So a moment ago, we walked through downtown Roslyn and talked about how many tall buildings exist there. We also panned through the city of Alexandria, but there are several other suburban downtowns that exist outside the city of Washington. Tyson's Corner and McLean are a downtown in their own right off in the Virginia suburbs, as is the downtown of Reston, Virginia, that is also out in the Virginia suburbs. Bethesda in Maryland and Silver Spring in Maryland are also downtowns in their own right. If you just looked at their skylines alone, you would think, boy, those are big cities. Well, in fact, they're just satellite cities to the city of Washington. College Park is home to the University of Maryland. It doesn't necessarily have a giant downtown, but is also a very significant peripheral suburb. So understanding some of these peripheral downtowns is very important to understanding the structure of Washington. If we were to scroll in on the downtown of Bethesda, just like Roslyn, you would see that there are a whole bunch of tall buildings, some of which border on skyscrapers. And as you pan around it, zoom around it, you see that it is a downtown skyline equivalent to the downtown skylines of many other large American cities. It just, again, happens to be a suburb of Washington, D.C., and not its own independent metropolitan area. And the same is the case if we were to pan over here to the city of Silver Spring. Not quite as obvious. Silver Spring feels like a downtown as you walk around it. Buildings are a little bit lower rise, but you can see this. There are still plenty of them, and a lot of big companies are based there in Silver Spring as well, despite being several miles from the core of Washington, D.C. So that is basically the structure of the nation's capital. To recap again, the 10 layers that we talked about here. layer one of the barbell, the White House to the Capitol, the OG Washington, D.C., with Pennsylvania Avenue as its linking spine. Number two, America's front and backyard, the National Mall, the place where all the 8th grade tour groups and tourists come to visit, one of the most visited places in the United States, the National Mall, number two. Number three, the Smithsonian institutions that line the National Mall. Number four, the U.S. Capitol grounds, which exist kind of in their own little universe. Number five, the federal agencies that sit north and south of the National Mall. Number six, talked about downtown D.C., the core kind of business hub of the city. Number seven, we talked about some of these neighborhoods that ring the immediate vicinity of downtown Washington. Number eight, we talked about this corridor emanating from DuPont Circle up into northwest D.C., really nice neighborhoods in Embassy Row. Number nine, we talked about the cluster of things that sit here kind of along the Virginia coastline of the Potomac River over here. And then number 10, we talked about the satellite cities, these ancillary downtowns that sit all over the region, but which support the broader ecosystem of Washington, D.C. D.C. in many cases, in many respects, is a lot like many other cities, but because of the federal government, because of the presidency and the Congress and the federal agencies, it has its own little ecosystem that works in unique ways. So it is all a little incestuous ball of corruption and things like that. The relationship between the way that the Congress and the White House have to work, the way that the agencies administer the laws, the way that the downtown, the lobbyists, the law firms, the consulting firms are all trying to kind of pile on and get either what they want or get what their clients want out of the federal government, the way that the think tanks and nonprofits pile into that ecosystem, and the way the defense contractors try to get business out of the federal government, supporting that as well. And then all of these surrounding companies that sort of exist as part of the broader region. For instance, Geico, the government employees insurance company, is now one of the largest private insurance companies in the country. The Marriott Corporation is located here in the metropolitan area of Washington and is also a very important part of the ecosystem. A great many companies are part of that ancillary network of satellite cities that are all part of this weird cluster of interests and things that go on around what has become the quintessential capital city of the world. I think while Washington, D.C. is continuing to evolve, it certainly competes with the great cities of the world. And whether that's for good or for ill, or however you may want to view Washington, D.C., it certainly is a place of structure and some beauty and some significance to our nation and to the world. So hopefully that helps you understand a little bit more of the history and the structure of Washington, D.C. While you're hanging out with us, if you wouldn't mind dropping a like and a subscribe in the video, those likes help us out with YouTube. The subscribes help you guys know when we are on. Check our description that has the link to our Duck Discord if you want to be part of a community affiliated with this channel. We welcome anybody and everybody who wants to join the Discord. The Duck Fund is our Buy Me a Coffee link if you want to help support the channel and the stream. We also have links to some of the other playlists and videos and things that we do here on this channel. Okay, that was a lot. We'll dig into more. Don't be strangers, because we will be back. For now, this is land that ain't just speculation, and I hope you all have a good night.